you're good to go.
Hello, everyone.
Okay.
And welcome to folks who are joining us in the internets. My name is Jody Koberinsky. I've been invited by the Grad Students Association of the University of Waterloo, along with my colleague Margaret, to moderate this really important session today, politics number 4 discussion on the 50 by 30 campaign. And so for folks just joining us, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how this time together is going to go. And then I will give introductions that are going to be pass-off introductions. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time eulogizing ourselves, but we do want to give a bit of background so folks who are listening know who they're listening to and in what context and from what context people are speaking. I wanted to start by acknowledging that while we might be in the internets, the Grad Student Association at University of Waterloo is connected to land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe, Arawandaraon, and Six Nations peoples. We live within the Haldimand Tract, which was given to First Nations allies of the government of the time, and told that this entire land base would be theirs in perpetuity. We have pushed those folks down to a space of less than 2% of that original landmass, and each and every one of us on this call needs to become more aware of that situation and find out how you can become involved in land back efforts in the region. So having said that, I'm going to move on. We are going to do a quick introduction. The panelists will discuss the material that they've prepared for about 40 minutes, and then we'll move into a question and answer section. So I will go ahead and give a little bit of a background on the 50 by 30 campaign. And of course, Kai and Megan and Scott and those involved more directly can fill in the bits. But this was started as a grassroots community-led campaign advocating for Waterloo Region to commit by 50% reduction in greenhouse gas outputs by 2030. We have a broader commitment as a region to reduce by 80% by 2050. But this group came together with an awareness that delayed action is denied action, and that there's a reason to engage more quickly. The campaign builds on a commitment from all the municipalities actually to reach these targets. What else do I want to say? We've had some conversations about build back better. And I think that many of the folks involved with the 50 by 30 campaign see this as an opportunity to move away from notions of building back towards some unsustainable version of what we were doing. And it's a real opportunity to be fundamentally creative in ways that seemed impossible just 2 years ago, that open themselves up and present new opportunities. I don't know if we decided an order in which we're going to go. So then I am going to go ahead and I'm going to ask Megan to go first and introduce herself, and go ahead and do your portion of the talk. And when you're ready, you can hand off to the next panelist.
Thanks, Jody. I'm Meg Rattan-Walker, and I'm a local climate organizer and activist here in Waterloo Region. I have been organizing in the Fridays for Future strikes since early 2019, late 2018, culminating in that really big strike in September 2019. And since the beginning of the 50 by 30 campaign, I've also been organizing with that as well. I'm also a mom, and that factors in a lot into my action and the work that I do around Waterloo Region. Kai?
For sure. So yeah, I'm Kai Reimer-Watts, and also a co-organizer with 50 by 30, and a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'm in the community psychology program there, and a lot of my research is focused on climate change mobilization and the use of the arts and storytelling, which is really close to my own heart, for disrupting narratives of the status quo, to try to move us to a far more just, safe climate future. And so the arts and visioning, I think, has a powerful role to play in that. and as part of the 50 by 30 campaign as well. How can we envision something better? And just on a personal note, I don't have any children. I certainly think about the young people of the world who are inheriting this, and I also count myself still in that the actions that we are going to take over the next 10 years are going to fundamentally shape the kind of future that I'm able to live, even so. Yeah, those are some of the reasons I engage with this work. Scott?
Thanks, Kai. I'm Scott Morton, you know Mia, and I was born here in the region, been living here a good chunk of my life. I'm a grad student at University of Waterloo, registered through Balsillie in the Global Governance program, and also in the environment faculty at UW. Yeah, I've gotten involved in 50 by 30 recently, been involved in climate action work for a little while now. And also getting pretty involved in Indigenous solidarity and justice work here in the region and really across Canada, I guess, in some ways. But yeah, and my research is looking at how both those issues intersect and how specifically how we can decarbonize our energy systems in the region and decolonize them at the same time. So I can speak more about that later if people are interested. But yeah, I also have, I mean, definitely, as Kai said, you don't have to have kids to be worried about this issue and be engaged and be working hard on this issue. Myself, I have 3 kids and I have to look them in the eye every day. And, you know, I want to, when I'm looking in the eye, I want to say to them, like, I'm doing everything that I can to make sure that you have the kind of future that I want for you and that you can build for yourselves. So yeah, that's me.
Great. So we have a series of questions that I'm going to work through, and, you know, let's have this be a bit free flowing. If you feel like you want to speak to that question, great. If it triggers something for you, though, that you think it's important for people to hear, this isn't a job interview. I want to encourage folks to run with what you're inspired to share, because it's often the thing that's required at the moment. And our questions are really focusing on this issue that's been raised by all 3 of you, actually, around social justice and climate solutions. And one of the questions we had for you in your own work, what does it mean for you to center social justice in climate solutions? And we'll start with Scott.
Excellent. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of things that means. And I think one of the main things for me is making sure that if we're saying we need climate solutions now, right from the get-go, we need to be thinking about solutions that are figuring out how we create climate solutions that actually benefit everyone across the income spectrum, you know, people of all different backgrounds, all different races. One of the big challenges, one of the big reasons why we're in the situation we are is that we've built our energy systems and all our governance systems, our education systems, all of them are built on white supremacy, and white supremacy has built a lot of myths that I've benefited from, absolutely, around that the environment is somehow over the economy, that man is somehow over nature, and I use man very explicitly, very intentionally in that phrase, because, you know, white supremacy is also about the patriarchy. So so I think when we're looking for climate solutions, we can't repeat all those mistakes and create solutions that are propping up that patriarchy and perpetuating that supremacy, that myth of white supremacy, and the realities of it too. So those are some of the first things I'd say. Others feel free to jump in. I'll just keep, I've got a couple other ideas on this, but I don't want to be like rambling forever here, but there's so many things that could be said about this. I think in terms of centering social justice, I think when we look at what would Waterloo Region specifically look like if we're implementing climate solutions that are centering justice. It means creating affordable housing for everyone, affordable housing that's energy efficient, that would contribute to climate solutions. It also means creating transit-oriented development that includes people of all income levels. So we're not creating, there's a lot of developments happening along the LRT corridor. When I look at it, I say, is any of this development that's happening along the LRT corridor affordable to people making less than a six-figure salary? That's a very important issue that I think we have to look at. If we're saying we need, we need to beautify our neighborhoods, we need to plant more trees because they're carbon, that not only are they beautiful and wonderful and great for humans, they're also a carbon sink. And so we need to think about where are we going to plant those trees? Is it going to be in the beautiful suburban neighborhoods that only some people can afford, or are we going to plant them everywhere? So those are just some of the ideas that come to mind. I think another extremely important one is that if we're developing climate solutions, and this is one of the things I'm looking at in my research, is we need to go to the folks that are the original caretakers, the original inhabitants of this land that have been here millennia before any of us European descent people were, and ask them, what makes sense? How do we create climate solutions that are rooted in the land? So that's another important piece of this, but a lot could be said about, but others that I don't know if you have more to add to that.
I do. When we talk about the myths of white supremacy, one of the things that we've learned is that there's such a thing as over there, and that somehow we're exempt from ecological devastation. And when in fact, we're just kind of delaying it. And eventually it will come down to us anyways. And in that myth of the over there, we think that we can extract endlessly from another place and we won't have damage. And there's people that live there, but they don't matter as much as us because they're not the same color as us. And I think it's coming down, and you see a lot of this in white environmental circles, that there's a lot of climate anxiety now happening. And I think that's fair, but we also have to understand that we've benefited this whole time from the over there, and we are responsible for it, and we have to bring it home, and we have to make these changes here. And while I absolutely agree that with Scott that we have to talk to Indigenous people about what the solutions are, we have to actually give them the power and the sovereignty to implement those solutions, not just because they're for us, but because Indigenous people have been protecting this land far longer than I have, far longer than any of us have. And they are not environmentalists. They are land defenders. They are trying to survive an ongoing genocide in Canada. So when we think about environmentalism, it's sometimes a very white environmentalism. And people who have been redlined, people who have been marginalized, Black, Indigenous people of color have been fighting for survival. And it's not environmentalism, it's survival. And I think white people are now just coming to the understanding that we also have to fight for survival. And part of fighting for that survival, part of the integral part of that fight is locking arms with people who have been marginalized and people of color. And the people who've been doing this work far longer than we have.
Really great additions, Megan. Thanks. Kai, do you have something to add as well?
I think that both of you spoke volumes there. I would just also add that, this is a global crisis. Our work takes place grounded in a local place, but ultimately to achieve the scale of change that's needed, nobody can be left out of this. And so I say that just also from, anyone who, I think the argument around climate action, that we just need to focus on getting emissions down and everything else is, secondary, is a very tired and debunked argument. And so we can clearly see how the climate crisis touches all aspects of society and our lives. And it's very far from being just an environmental crisis that we kind of put in a box and it's just happening out there. It is a social crisis. It is touching our communities, of course, to varying degrees. And so recognizing that the climate crisis is itself a massive injustice, and that those who have often contributed the least to it are on the front lines of impacts, just yet again underscores that all climate solutions need to have a justice component. They need to be social justice solutions. Without that, this, as it continues to impact people around the world, there's the very real risk that it could worsen social inequities all around the world. So from any perspective of ethics, we should be engaging on this from a justice lens, but then also just from the perspective of effectiveness, right? That there's so many solutions that can emerge from the diversity of communities that are implicated in this, that we would be losing so much brilliant contributions by not engaging from a justice front. So yeah, I think that's it.
That's really great. And in your answers, all three of you sort of touched a little bit on, in the absence of a social justice framing, what results. We heard from Scott talk a little bit about gentrification along the LRT route, which is an opportunity to, really shift the climate dynamic and how it impacts people who are from historically and contemporarily marginalized communities. You all sort of pointed around either directly or indirectly the issue of colonialism and extractive economies. And I think that's something that people aren't thinking about it as much. And so that was really interesting to hear. And just the idea of moving away from a technological solution, which drives sort of eco-fascism and techno-fascism, away from the kind of eco-socialism or eco-collectivity that you folks speak to. And so I'm segueing, using all these big university words, into a question about the university community itself. And if the folks are able to answer to the best of your knowledge, what is it, how is the University of Waterloo generally, and the Grad Students Association specifically, and Sabine, you're free to jump in and answer as well, how are the university and the GSA engaged in climate action, climate change action, from your experience?
I can speak to that a little bit. I'm outside of the university sphere, but I know that Fossil for UW has been really, really helpful. Leslie Johnston, who I see is also attending, that group was really fundamental to our organizing the big climate strike in September 2019, mobilized a huge student base. So I'm deeply grateful for that. And organizations like Fossil for UW, which is urging the university to divest, which it should divest right now, is great. Absolutely helpful. And it shows that the university doesn't have to be in its own white ivory tower, little silo. You need to be out in the community, and I love what they do.
Yeah, and Scott, can you speak to this at all, or?
Yes, I can, to a certain extent. Yeah, I would echo Meg's comment about the 2019 climate strike.
Might need to turn your video off.
Yeah, Scott, you're clipping in and out.
But I was kind of along for the ride, and to see all the people that gathered at the University of Waterloo in front of Dana Porter Library, and then marched to
Hi, are you there?
Am I okay now?
No, you want to try again, Scott?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. We didn't hear
I am
most of what you
here.
said though. If you could, yeah, if you could
Okay, can you hear me now?
repeat what
Oh,
you
perfect.
yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just start off by echoing what Meg was saying about, I wasn't one of the organizers for the climate strike in 2019, but I was one of the students who came and gathered in front of Dana Porter, and we went down to Waterloo Town Square. That was a fantastic feeling to be part of such a big group. I know that the University of Waterloo has a sustainability office that's working hard to make the university more sustainable. I would really urge them to continue to be as ambitious as they possibly can be. The university is a big institution. I think there needs to be a stronger push, and I know fossil fuel. I think there has to be a stronger push from the inside to divest at the University of Waterloo. I think there has to be, more done to make the university campus more sustainable as well. I know we've built a lot of buildings on that campus in the last decade or so. Most, if not all of them, are powered by fossil fuels. And I think the university has an opportunity to be a real leader in that aspect. Back in 2016, I did some research on this as part of my master's, and we looked at the energy output, the energy use for the entire region of Waterloo. And when we did, we made a little, like basically a graph of it. And University of Waterloo's energy was quite a sizable chunk of the energy for the region. I was surprised how much the university uses. And if you look at heat maps for the region, I'm sure that if you looked at the area above University of Waterloo, you'd see a lot of heat rising off that campus. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of the university reducing its energy use. But I also think there's a lot of potential there because we've got so many great brains there at the University of Waterloo, so many grad students and undergrads who have good ideas. So I would encourage all students at University of Waterloo to be pushing for not only for the university itself to be more energy efficient and to divest from fossil fuels, to use fewer fossil fuels as quickly as possible on campus, and also to be a voice. You know, as University of Waterloo, we represent, I don't know how many students there are at the university now, at least 30,000, probably almost 40 at University of Waterloo itself. If you've got even a small percentage of those voices speaking to regional council, I think it would make a huge impact in terms of if we got even 10% of students at the university saying we need to go 50 by 30, I think, you know, there's no way that council could ignore that kind of a voice. Anyway, those are some of my ideas.
And I just wanted to also add, University of Waterloo offers a Master of Climate Change program. We have the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. There's a lot of really great research that's going on, but as the folks who've spoken so far have indicated, the university itself has still invested fairly heavily in fossil fuels and is unwilling to adopt some of the language at the UN around climate in its sort of financial investment guidance documents that fossil fuel University of Waterloo has been putting pressure on. So folks are listening and are interested, do follow up with Leslie, and then I'm going to hand it on to Kai. Go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I actually went through the UW's Master of Climate Change program. I know that there's some fantastic research work and work around sustainability innovation happening at the university. But what I find quite problematic is this kind of contradictory existence that a university can position itself as being on the forefront of sustainability and environmental work, while at the same time directly investing in those industries that are directly undermining its students' futures, right? That are directly fueling the climate crisis and undermining our futures. So I think that this huge contradiction needs to be pointed out loud and clear, not only at UW, but institutions really across Canada and the globe, that we cannot no longer be in this place of, on the one hand, funneling money into the fossil fuel industry, and on the other hand, claiming to be innovators. That's a complete contradiction.
Noted and agreed. When we were not under lockdown and pandemically distancing from each other, students were meeting every Friday in front of Dana Porter when there were not broader community initiatives. And anyone can go by themselves, even during COVID lockdown, take a photograph of yourself on strike in front of the library, hashtag Fridays for Future, keep the momentum going. One of the things that we have historically not done well as settler-led environmental movements is organize in an ongoing fashion and really build that longer-term capacity. And so I'm going to use that as a segue into asking the three of you to tell us a little bit more specifically about the 50 by 30 campaign. Maybe its origins, who is involved, what priorities do folks have, what's been achieved so far, what's next, and maybe how folks listening in might get involved with picking up the work. I'm going to just hand that as a general set of questions to the three of you and let you roll through conversation with it a little bit. And if I need to, I'll jump in and guide, but I'm going to ask Megan to start.
So the 50 by 30 campaign, I mean, I'm speaking for everybody here, came out from essentially we wanted momentum after the big climate strike in 2019. We had just declared a climate emergency, Waterloo Region wide, and we saw all of the support we have for local climate action. It was the biggest climate strike in Waterloo Region history, second only to the Black Lives Matter march that happened in June, the following June. So, I mean, Laura and Kai and Andres specifically started to bring people together around different pillars the summer after that. So the summer of 2020, so after the pandemic hit, and we realized we'd all be kind of distant and we'd have to change our tactics. We came together around pillars of climate action, and we approached them all with a specifically social justice lens. So for instance, I was on the food sovereignty panel. So what I looked at a lot is how do we incorporate Indigenous food knowledge in a post-capitalist way so that everybody could have access to food that's healthy for them, and it's regenerative agriculture, and not just good for us, but also local and good for the planet, something that we could continue to generate despite the fact we're losing topsoil, despite the fact that the climate is warming and it's compromising our ability to grow food in a large scale way. And I think probably Kai or Scott can also talk about this a bit, because the way that I interacted with it is a little bit different, I think, than the way Kai and maybe Scott did.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that was a great intro. And there were a number of other justice pillars around housing, around energy, around transportation, around public health and education, and then food, as Megan spoke to. So really trying to ground this. I mean, when folks hear 50 by 30, it's catchy, it's numerical, but at the end of the day, to really achieve anything at this scale will take transformative efforts across a wide diversity of sectors and areas of life, basically, and in our society. And so that was kind of the idea behind these pillars. None of us are an expert in all of these, but this is where community knowledge is so valuable, because by coming together and bringing a diversity of people together, we can really start to emerge the solutions that are needed. And I think we really started to see that with some of the brainstorming on these pillars over the summer. And the intention behind that is to also kind of form some of the basis of both our work over the next 10 years. That's the big picture, right? This is really a multi-year effort to create a more just and green Waterloo Region. And then also as we go to council, that as a first step for this campaign, as kind of like a goalpost, so to speak, we will be bringing a motion for 50 by 30 forward to council, likely sometime this spring. And we want that to be informed by social justice principles, and to be sharing some of the bottom-up knowledge that we received of how we can achieve a 50% reduction over the next 10 years. And so, yeah, just to respond quickly to the question around how, like, the next steps forward for this campaign, basically this builds off of having the region pass a climate emergency declaration a year and a half ago. And so now we're going back to the region and saying, okay, it's good that there has been a formal acknowledgement that we are in an emergency, but we still haven't seen anything near the scale of action that is needed. And we need to really start making some firm commitments. We're already late in this. We need to commit to what the science is telling us. So for us, 50 by 30 did not come out of thin air. It's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says is really the minimum globally to secure a safe climate future in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And so essentially we're going to government and saying, we have to meet this. Like, you know, as a wealthy, innovative part of the world, how could we not do our part in this and begin that transition to a far more just, sustainable society over the years ahead. So yeah, I'll pause there. And Meg, do you want to jump in?
I do. A lot of what the process of what we're doing at this moment looks like is a lot of lobbying, politicians, garnering support, seeing where our support already is and where we could possibly build it. And it's a lot of community building. I know that even after the pandemic hit and before it, we were going out to support Indigenous-led protests, especially after the Canadian government, and again, continuing genocide against Indigenous people, you know, trying to put a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory out in what's called British Columbia. And a lot of us went out to the Black Lives Matter protest. So it's not just about lobbying politicians, oh, that's a lot of what we're doing right now. It's about community building, not just for now and not just for this motion, but into the future, into the 10 years that we have to have emissions, into the 30 years we have to get to net zero, which, you know, net zero, depending on what you think, actual zero would be good. It's about long-term work and the long-term vision for Waterloo Region. And it's essentially going to be the rest of my life, at least the vast majority of the rest of my life. And I imagine everybody else's. I think that when we talk about climate action, we think of it as a binary, either it stops or it continues, but it's essentially an era. It's the conditions for human life on this planet ongoing. And that's true for Waterloo Region as well. So it's not just about emotion. It's not just about lobbying. It's not just about one of us. It's about all of us, essentially forever. So we want a long-term holistic vision for Waterloo Region going forward.
Wow, I actually typed that into the chat. Climate action is the condition for human activity on the planet going forward. It is not an event. It's not something we're going to achieve and move on from. It is going to be a multi-generational effort to regenerate and try to reclaim some of lost ecological diversity in order that biology can be here. And I think that it's very easy to forget about this. It's like, oh, I'll do next season. I'll do that next season. like that this is ever going to stop. Now, a clarifying comment, I just wanted to let folks listening in on the chat know when we are talking about council, we're talking about regional council or city councils, as opposed to a separate council of folks. And Scott, I'm going to pass the mic on to you now.
Yes, perfect. That's a perfect segue into what I was about to say, which was, because we're on politics today, we better talk the politics of all of this. And I think they're important because we've talked about council a number of times now. And when we're talking about council, we're talking specifically about Region of Waterloo Council. And so, you know, there are people from like grad students from all over the world who may or may not know how politics works. And most of us here in the region don't know how the politics works around here because it's kind of complicated. And you've got these different levels of even local government. So we've got government, you know, your kind of classic city council of each of the townships in Waterloo Region. You've got 3 cities, Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge. And then you've got this other level of government, which is Region of Waterloo. So that's the body that would oversee, you know, that governs, I guess you could say, you know, the 600 and some odd thousand of us who live within the borders of what they call the Region of Waterloo. So, and that's the group that we're focused on with our campaign, but all those different local governments are important in this. And part of, I talk a lot about the importance of local level governments with climate change. Often we hear about, in the news, you hear about Justin Trudeau flying to Copenhagen, signing this document, what have you. And we think of it as this kind of national level problems or an international, you know, the international leaders are the ones who are going to solve this for us. And they absolutely have a responsibility to do everything they can. And I think it's also really important to remember the role of our local governments because, and Canadian Federation of Canadian Municipalities has this on their website. If you look at all the emissions that are going into the atmosphere every year, local governments have authority over 50% of those emissions. So they've got there's a lot of authority there for local governments, and therefore a lot of power and a lot of responsibility for local governments to be acting on climate change. And the other benefit of that is that local governments are much more accessible to us as students and as citizens than you write a letter to Justin Trudeau. What's the chance you're ever going to hear back from him in your lifetime? You know, and all of us on the campaign have been contacting our local councillors, and we've been hearing back from them. They are engaged. They are relatively very easy to get a hold of. And I've been pleasantly surprised with how engaged they've been and ready to listen to us and talk with us. So I'll just wrap up by saying what I'm saying here with that to me is a really important thing for students to know, because I think as students, sometimes we think, well, you know, what power do I have to impact this? You know, I think if you got your PhD cohort or your student club or whatever together and went to a local counselor, you could have some major impact by speaking to them, and you'd have somebody who would listen to you and be able to bring your message back to those local council tables, which have authority over 50% of all the emissions that are released every year. So local governments are a really important place for us to engage in terms of climate action. That's it for me for now.
Really appreciate that. And then Margaret, do you have any, you've been listening for a bit and we're part of helping us generate some of this discussion and some of these questions. I'm going to ask you if you want to just step in and reflect on what you've heard so far, and then we'll jump back into a few more questions with the panelists.
I'm sure. Thank you so much, Jody, for mentioning that. It's been a really good and interesting discussion so far. Part of the next discussion is going to be thinking about more broadly how climate change is impacting people around the world right now. And so obviously, while in the Waterloo region, we're thinking more long-term and trying to mitigate some of the consequences long-term, there are places where the impact on our environment is affecting people right now, but even in Canada too. So it would be good to reflect on that if you can, and maybe share in a more short-term way how folks can actively get involved as well in mitigating those issues.
I'll just jump into that quickly, and I think that's an excellent question. I also think that we need to reflect here in Waterloo Region about where our energy is coming from. So it's kind of twofold. I mean, here in this particular part of Southern Ontario, definitely like much of the world, we have seen a change in climate, but we have not necessarily felt the same level of impacts as many others around the world have. And then on top of this, we are burning and using energy every day, driving the climate crisis, that much of that energy is not extracted here. We don't see often the physical infrastructure that is harming communities elsewhere. And so I think both of those things drive home the responsibility to make those connections. And I know at UW, for instance, there are a lot of students who aren't only in Waterloo Region, right? That there's a lot of international students at the university as well. And we really need to, as a region, start understanding our responsibility, yes, to our own residents, but also to the broader world, that we have a role to play as a wealthy city in a wealthy country, that has benefited from colonialism and violence against the land, that we have a role to play in healing that, and not just kind of shirking that responsibility and going, well, we're just going to hope that we're okay, right? So I think the idea of global justice is really important to this campaign as well. I've heard Meg use the phrase before, that speed is justice. And I think that is a powerful phrase. I mean, rich countries have passed the buck for generations now, and just gone, well, the rest of the world can pick up the mess. It's time for us to also be really taking seriously the crises we've created, both for our own survival and for just care for the broader global community. So yeah, hopefully that speaks to that a little bit.
Okay, and then I'm gonna just ask one final question, and then I think we're gonna start to move toward a Q&A, so that we have a chance to hear from people on the call, and maybe even hearing some perspectives that haven't been brought forward. Many of you are involved in coalitions outside of the 50 by 30, or aware of other overlapping and intersecting initiatives that have a climate focus. Could you maybe outline to students and others on the call what other initiatives are happening in the community that are overlapping, or other organizations that may be involved in the 50 by 30 initiative that people can get engaged with?
I can speak to that a little bit, and then feel free to jump in, others.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, so one of the other organizations that I've been involved with is Faith Climate Justice, and we're people of faith who are concerned about obviously climate justice. We started coming together. Well, people of faith have been working on these issues for a long time, and we've started coming together in the region. We had a meeting recently where we brought people together from across different faiths to engage, and many of them mentioned when we met that back in 2019 we had Diane Sachs here in the region, and she was the Ontario Environment Commissioner, at that time. And she said very clearly in that meeting, and a lot of us remember it, she said, I haven't heard much from faith communities. Faith communities have been relatively silent on these issues, and they need to start speaking up. So we took that, and in a lot of places have been far too silent. And part of that is this whole interlocking, it's very, we're in a very comfortable place as white Christians. We don't have to worry about climate change. But then you've got Christians in places like the Philippines, for example. The Catholics in the Philippines have been extremely outspoken and active on climate issues. And part of that is because the Philippines has been impacted very severely by climate change already. So I think, that's one group that I've been involved in locally. And then also some of my work has been on truth and reconciliation, Indigenous justice and solidarity. And there are so many connections there. So that's another overlapping area. If others want to speak to that, please feel free.
I know one of our organizers, Laura Hamilton, she works with a Better Tent City. And, there's a lot of invisible impacts, even though I can speak for myself, we haven't been feeling the impacts of climate change the same way. The pandemic is absolutely a result of ecological disturbance and human infringement on systems and ecological systems that we're not supposed to. So that's where the coronavirus came from. And we see homeless people, unsheltered people here. They're not responding. They don't have the resources to deal with the pandemic the same way. And that is also a climate impact. So a Better Tent City does great work here. We also see places, organizations like Young City Growers, and they are, they're a lot of Black Indigenous people of color who are growing food together. And it's something I've been looking to volunteer with. I talked to Carly Rath, who helps organize that as well. So that's absolutely a climate organization, whether it's a linear connection or not. How do we grow better food locally that is accessible to all kinds of people, no matter what their income level is, or everybody essentially. So they do really lovely work. I've been working with Fridays for Future, and we talk about how climate change is an intergenerational crime, but we also don't talk enough about how the 2-degree target is actually about how much we're willing to sacrifice. Because we're seeing right now how the climate impacts are coming down to the world's most marginalized, most vulnerable. And it is the level of acceptability decided on by white governments in the global north, essentially, about what we could sacrifice and how much we could extract from the land before we were willing to put a stop to it. So when I talk about speed is justice, there's absolutely no reason to wait. Right, we should not be looking to meet our targets as far as climate goals are concerned, because people are already suffering. Right, so, and I think when we talk about intergenerational injustice and Fridays for Future, we don't talk enough about how it's not just about our children and me, it's about people who are suffering right now and why we've decided to sacrifice those people.
That's actually an interesting segue, Meg, and hard to actually continue to talk past, because when those things come to my consciousness, it's a moment for me to stop and pause and think about the actual humans and our non-human kin and our forests and our fish friends who are really suffering right now. And it's hard to not succumb to a bit of grief. And so I just want to, for anybody who's listening along or who may be watching later, these moments of overwhelm, of the grief and awareness of what's happening, are absolutely part of what's required of us to maintain engagement. And so I really want to honor your vulnerability with that. And thank you for bringing it to our awareness. We've discussed amongst us in our various bits of work that, there are a lot of myths that come with the mechanistic mind, that come with reductionist thinking that really drives secular, consumerist, transactional society. Would you be willing to speak for just a couple of minutes about what are some of the myths or things that people believe about the world or about the climate or about our capacities or whatever that we could do well to let go of? One of the ones I posted in the chat there was around that economics, right? We have these classical economics myths. Well, we have donut economics now. So I won't take up time, but look at that. That'll blow away all the things you've been taught to think about economy and governance and what we are limited to. And it's a new model. And so throwing it out there to folks on the panel, what new models, and Margaret, I'll ask you to speak to this as well. What has to change in our, what's the paradigm shift look like?
I can start with a pretty simple one that has been challenged many times, and we need to keep challenging it, which is the myth that there is some kind of a separation between our economy and the environment, and that these are somehow distinct entities, and hence what's happening, out there, so to speak, to the natural world is not really going to affect our economy. And this is a myth of luxury in largely wealthy countries, and sometimes can be promoted more by having such a technologically driven society that, if you're spending all of your time on a screen, or a majority of your time, then it can sometimes be easy to forget that, all of this, even our tech infrastructure, is fundamentally dependent on the natural world. And I should say it can be easy to forget until you get hungry and you want a meal, or until you get thirsty and you want a drink of water, or until you're struggling, to have clean air to breathe. Like we forget about these things until they are undermined, and suddenly it is so clear how deeply connected we are, and you wonder, how did we prioritize? How did we get our priorities so wrong? That we weren't putting it into the things that are fundamentally for our own well-being. And just to quickly make a tie-in there, neoliberal economics in particular, I think, has been very toxic. And without going into history too much, for young folks, we sometimes, this is the only form of capitalism that we've known. And it's just treated as normal. But it particularly promotes a lot of toxic myths around separation and human domination over the planet. And that really needs to be dismantled with a more relational worldview. And I think we can tie this back to Indigenous philosophies as well, that don't have this perspective of domination, but have a far more embedded relational worldview, that we are in relationship with the living world around us. We really need to start moving en masse towards that. Arrogance gets us to very dangerous places. Yeah.
Great.
I think
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Megan.
Jody.
I was actually going to say, that's great, Kai. Now, Megan, I'd love to hear from you.
I think we also have to think about labor as far as, I'm an eco-socialist. That is my political spectrum. And we have had, again, with the pandemic, we have seen how we're willing to sacrifice our laborers to the pandemic. These are the people upon which our civilization is built, on their backs. So if we disregard human life, we disregard natural life. Right, we have a separation. It's not just about ecology. It's about class and gender and who we feel are acceptable losses. So, part of the sort of beauty of donut economics and eco-socialism is the sharing of labor, and the ability to undermine a hierarchical capitalist structure where the 1% or the very few of us have a lot of wealth, but it's not shared. And if you look at the share of global emissions, you see that those of us in the global north, those of us that are in supposedly developed countries, we make 50% of the emissions. and yet we see diffused impacts. So in order for us to consider this new world, we have to think about where the labor happens, and it has to be not just here in Waterloo Region, not just here in Canada. And I think that's where we really fail along Canada's political parties on the left. We have to see that it's where the work happens in other places. You know, where do our phones get made? And what are the ecological impacts of that? It's a holistic view of humans and human labor and the natural world and how we extract and how we use that labor.
That's a really great point. Scott, have you got something to add? And then we'll go to Margaret.
Yes, I'm listening to all of this and I'm very interested. And one of the myths that I think we need to be busting as strongly as possible is a myth. And I speak about this from the perspective, as you can see in my picture there, I'm like at the apex of privilege in our society. And I think we need to bust this myth that we have to be comfortable, because our energy systems, our governance systems, all these systems have been built so that people who look like that dude on the screen are comfortable. And so to disrupt those systems that are contributing to this planetary disaster that we are all talking about, we need to be people like me need to be willing to be uncomfortable. And Jody, when you asked the first question of the panel, how do we center social justice, and asked it to the 40-year-old white guy first, if you had a blood pressure monitor on me, you would have seen the numbers going up quickly. But I'm glad that you did, because it's exactly what we need to be doing, is making white folks uncomfortable, because all those interlocking systems are built to keep us, and I say us as, you know, as a white person, all of those systems are created and being perpetuated to keep us comfortable, so that we don't have to be concerned about the impacts of climate change on all the people that, as Megan was saying, are the acceptable losses. And, you know, especially white folks who have higher incomes. You know, so these are some of the things. I think that's a really important myth that we have to bust, is that, you know, if we're going to make, you know, speaking for myself, if we as white folks of privilege want to address climate change, we need to be willing to go out there and be uncomfortable in a lot of different ways, and start, you know, overturning some of these systems and fundamentally changing them. So yeah, that's all. There's lots more to say, but that's all I'm going to say for now.
Thank you,
I think
Scott.
that's really at the core of Land Back and Defund the Police as well. These are systems that are specifically meant to make white settlers uncomfortable, and we have to be unsettled. And by that I mean like emotionally and physically, as settler colonialism needs to be uprooted. And you see the pushback when you talk about Land Back and when you talk about defund the police, because the policing is a white supremacist institution, and it's, again, like Scott said, meant to make us white people feel safe, when it doesn't. It's simply there to create order and the establishment and the status quo that is also part of perpetuating the climate crisis. So we do need to be uncomfortable, and I think white environmentalism has been very bad at that, about acknowledging that it comes from greater sources than just, you know, technology and disrupting nature. We have to be unsettled. We have to be uncomfortable, and we have to be able to live with that discomfort. Otherwise, we can't be responsible for the work we need to do.
Oh, Margaret, would you like to add something or reflect on what you've heard?
Sure. I'd just like to briefly reflect and just add on to what Kai mentioned about, you know, the disconnect in our way of life from what's happening in nature. And I can reflect on that because, you know, I live in Canada, but obviously I come from Uganda and Africa, so I'm able to see the difference in lifestyle. And so, you know, just being in Canada and any wealthy country, for instance, you have a constant supply of electricity, constant supply of water. You know, supermarkets are always filled up with food. And so if you live in a context like that, you have no reality of what's happening in nature. And when you come, for instance, in Uganda, which is a very agricultural context, for instance, a drought means significant impact on our communities in terms of access to food, in terms of income, right? Because this food is sold to create income for children, for instance, to go to school. We also depend on seasonal changes. So obviously for years, our communities understand that throughout this time to this time, it's the rainy season, it's the dry season. But all that is becoming unpredictable in these contexts. And so it's really impacting folks right now. If you think of floods, for instance, access to healthcare is difficult for many communities when floods happen. And these issues predominantly impact women and children, of course, because they find it most difficult to travel in these types of terrains. So that disconnect, or that come back to nature and the indigenous ways of life that you have spoken about, I think as a human race, we are missing out on that, and spending time in nature and noticing, the trees are changing, or it's not raining as much. We don't pay attention to those things anymore, but those are the signals that tell us that the environment is changing, and therefore we need to act. So there's a disillusion there that I can sympathize must be really difficult for folks who haven't been in a natural environment to understand or to come to terms with.
Thank you, Margaret. Anybody else want to just add anything to make sure we've got a fulsome discussion on that piece? Kai, go ahead.
I'll be brief. I just want to echo everything that has been said, and go back to the idea of comfort a little bit. I completely agree, and I like the way that Scott and Megan put it, that we need to be willing to be uncomfortable and to unsettle ourselves. And I would say, and in addition to that, we need to spend time redefining what comfort could mean into the future. And I think, that's an area where, again, with environmental movements, even social justice movements, if we're constantly being put in a position of reacting to what we don't want, we don't always have the space to begin to envision the world we do want. And so, I think it can sometimes be used as ammo against movements to say, this is all just about sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. And of course, folks are afraid of change. There's a natural fear of that. One of the ways that I often frame this is that large-scale change is coming whether we prepare for it or not. The pandemic is a great example of that. How many of us were just totally blindsided by this massive change that came and hit us, right? Now with the climate crisis, we have an opportunity, we have the foresight to at least see some of the predicted changes, right, that will make life so much more difficult. And Margaret gave a taste of how that's already playing out in different parts of the world. And we can change course. We can shape our direction so that we're not just kind of fated to snowball from crisis to crisis. And I think that's the empowering piece that we really need to communicate to folks, right? That this is not, yes, it's a huge challenge, but we can change direction. And what we do right now over the next 10 years, with the vast amount of resources available, really matters. And the last tie-in I'll make, right, is that the COVID pandemic has laid bare that all of the arguments from government that we can't do it, it's too much money, it's too quick, et cetera, they've all been busted, right? Look at how quickly the response was to this pandemic. Look at the scale of resources that got mobilized, right? And we can critique things about it, certainly from a justice lens. But the argument that we don't have enough money, that we can't do this in the time that's required, is just totally false. So I just wanted to,
That's a great. I started you down wrap up, and then we got a question here in the Q&A. And so in the interest of, I know it's 4:07, I'm going to raise this question and let you folks take maybe 2 or 3 minutes with it. Scott, then I'm going to give you 1 minute to wrap up. I'm going to give Megan 1 minute to wrap up after. Does that sound fair? So I'm going to read this out. One of the biggest myths of all is of infinite economic, material, and energy growth on a finite planet. If we understand the moral duty of wealthy nations to urgently shrink material and energy throughput, and this can be done while improving quality of life, it seems like we can't afford to skirt the question of growth and capitalism, which donut economics has a tendency to do. What's the place of degrowth in theoretical analysis, movement building, and political strategy? And so I will preface with, I would argue that donut economics doesn't have a tendency to do anything. It's who is using the material, that theory, and in what manner. And so if in your thinking of how you're constructing your donut is done in a way that's sustaining minded, it will implicitly degrowth is in there. It's just that it doesn't put out degrowth as a non-starter conversation because there's been some issues around that sort of language. But we could argue that that's the same conversation we're getting around defund, and it isn't one. So just wanted to put that back out to the three of you. Within the 50 by 30 movement, how do you deal with that lack of willingness to prioritize? Is there space for a more active degrowth conversation here?
This is something I advocate for regularly, if not degrowth, but the shrinking of certain kinds of economies and the growth of other kinds of economies. So the economies of care. And I think that a lot of people hear degrowth and they assume that everybody has to shrink. We all have to make ourselves small, and we all have to take on poverty. But it's really not. I'm sorry, my cat is approaching. It's really not about that. It's about focusing human well-being not on the GDP, but on on actual human well-being. And a lot of the conversations that came out of the early use of the GDP as a metric for human well-being ignored things like caregiving, a lot of gendered, home-based or community-based economies. And it became the sort of global extractive economy. And I think that we do need to talk about what are the limits to our planet. We have a finite amount of resources, and a lot of us are taking, relatively few of us are taking up all of those resources when there are people that have nothing. So if we're going to talk about this from a moral perspective, we really do have to talk about where these resources go and who gets to benefit them, and how much of capitalism is waste, how much of it is just not necessary, and how that is actually causing violence around the world to people and to nature. So I really encourage people not to think of it as poverty. It's not poverty. It's about growing the world that we need collectively, growing the commons. Eleanor Ostrom, if you could look her up, she debunks the tragedy of the commons and writes. She's an ecological economist. She writes very specifically about how we can have a shared world. It doesn't have room for billionaires, quite frankly, but.
And so some need to have an adult conversation that might look like, we can talk about a world that is not organized by capital.
Yes, exactly.
Like,
and I think we have to have that. Yes, and people are afraid of it because that's the prevailing economic mode, but it doesn't have to be.
And so Scott or Kai, do either of you have thoughts on this really excellent question? And it's always an elephant in the room question, but worth taking on in the last 2 minutes of our meeting. And maybe we should think about having a whole other separate conversation about the politics of capitalism relative to this in a future session. But go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I want to echo the shout out to Eleanor Ostrom. I did a project on her in an economics course, and was told that wasn't real economics. So, I disagree. But anyway, Eleanor Ostrom is amazing. I think in Waterloo Region, there's so much opportunity for us to, we talk about being this innovative place of innovation, and we are in some ways, but when you look at our energy, 85% of it comes from fossil fuels that's extracted from somewhere else. We've talked about all the problems with that. There's more that we haven't talked about. What if we were to look at how we could create neighborhood energy in this region, and get our energy from the earth right where we are, rather than flying offshore and digging 300 kilometers offshore and digging down into the ocean floor. How does that make sense? Anyway, then you've also got, could you, when you're doing that neighborhood energy, could you plant more trees in that neighborhood so it's more beautiful? They're absorbing the carbon. Incorporate affordable housing. There's all kinds of really actually innovative things that we could do in this region to create a more beautiful, sustainable, just region. It's not about saying, we're going to cut this back and our lives are going to be terrible. It's like we could make a lot of people's lives better. We could have small businesses engaged in all of these solutions. Somebody's got to build that housing. Somebody's got to build those energy systems. Somebody's got to plant those trees. There's all kinds of ways that we can do energy differently in a way that is much more just and is much more creative than what we're doing now. That's it from me.
Great, thanks, Scott. And Kai, is there anything further to add to those excellent points that you want to contribute?
Sure. So briefly, I mean, there's another myth for you, the idea that growth will somehow and trickle down economics will somehow lift all boats, right? And I think whenever I hear growth, I think growth for whom, right? It's a word that is tossed around as if it has benefits for all, when that is so clearly not the case from even kind of a modest analysis. And growth under neoliberalism has just made this divide even worse. As Megan was saying, it's a billionaire class that is fed by this model, that wealth is largely being funneled to an already elite. So to me, when I hear growth, it is very much about power, and we need to shift those power structures. And as Scott and Megan were saying, there's an opportunity here for greater well-being for the vast majority. Such a harmful system has really not benefited the majority.
And folks who are listening can look up the excellent work that's been done in Bhutan by my colleagues on gross national happiness as an alternative indicator of societal development and well-being to the idea of GDP. Okay, we were mid wrap up. And so Kai, you had a moment to wrap up. I'm going to ask Scott to give us maybe a minute of closing thoughts, and then Megan, you to follow. And then we'll give folks listening one more opportunity to find out how to get engaged and move forward, and we'll try to wrap this up.
Sorry, you said Kai first and then me, or me
Nope,
first?
Kai already got to go. So you're gonna give us a wrap. I know it's a little bit unconventional in the order, but we do have to break our patterns and
Absolutely.
do things in a new way if we're gonna move forward. So we'll move through it like that.
Yeah. No, and so there's speaking of women doing great work, I do want to give a shout out to my PhD advisor, who's Sarah Birch, who's a CRC scholar at University of Waterloo, who's doing great work on small and medium-sized enterprises and the environment and the role that they can play in sustainable transformations. So and yeah, I'm very excited. I think the last thing I'll say is to the fellow UW students who are listening, I really encourage you to use your voice. There are literally thousands of fantastic brains and eloquent voices right here in the region that I love, and you can have an impact. And I really urge you to use that power that you have to use your voice and make an impact, and speak to our leaders and others on the climate action that we have to take to achieve 50 by 30 locally. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. And Megan?
I know there's a lot of grief and a lot of anxiety and a lot of devastation and despair around the climate crisis. I feel it every day. I feel it as a mom, but I think that we need to really have, I think Kim Stanley Robinson calls it an angry optimism, we can do this. And I think we don't talk enough about how we can do it. We need the grief, but we need the hope in equal measure. And, you know, we aren't particularly special, the group of us. We are just trying to do things that we locally, we're trying to get the leverage points we can because we love this planet and we love this community, and anybody can do this. And it is possible for radical change to happen. Absolutely possible. And we can do it together because we need to do it together. And I guess if anything, I want that sort of prevailing, not hope, not pessimism, but we can do this and we can do it. And now, it's now, time is now.
Amazing. So we have Kai reminding everybody that one immediate action is to weigh in on the climate action strategy. You have until April 12th. There is a link in the chat. We will include it in the reposting of this video or in the Facebook feed beneath hand in the next couple of days. We'll add that there. People can also get involved with 50 by 30. The thousands of brains and researchers and folks with advanced degrees who've come through Laurier and Waterloo and have stayed put in this community, who have the capacity to engage. It doesn't have to be a lot all the time. It can be one little piece of committee work. You can pick a piece that's yours to do. Also consider that we're headed to a provincial election, and there will be more activity around this group as we move into that space. So keep yourself open to maybe doing some phone banking as we move forward. There are so many ways to involve yourself. Reminding everybody that the current strategy calls for only a 30% reduction by 2030, and there is a strong resistance within some of the folks who've been doing this work in a more conventional way to budge from the 80 by 50. One of the things that's missing entirely from all of this discussion is how the food system can profoundly change these numbers. It's very difficult to quantify. And so soils and food have been basically left out entirely of the Waterloo approach. And that's because a model was chosen by which we measure the externalities created by activity in the region and not the externalities created to bring things into the region. And so since 80% of our food is brought in from outside the region, that's 80% of our eating that does not count at all right now in the sustainable Waterloo Region system. And so really making some advocacy around, it's great that we picked a model that went with Paris to quantify how we're doing things, but that doesn't mean it's the best science or the best way to tackle what we're up to. And so there's some creative work that grad students or recent grads could do, grad student association members, I'm talking to you right now, to help the 50 by 30 crew really make the case for thinking outside of the box that Sustainable Waterloo Region is working with alongside Waterloo Region. So a little bit of encouragement for folks to do that. Pressure, please don't forget to write letters to our university president asking to divest. It's not a problem to pick up the phone and make it a habit to call once a week. Get to know your local administrator, and by all means, making donations to the 50 by 30 campaign. It does cost money to do grassroots action, and it often gets just picked up by the people at the table. And so email transfers or looking online to see if there's a donation spot on the website, I'm encouraging people to do that. Great. So thank you again for everyone. Thanks to the Grad Student Association for taking the time to host us. This is such an important conversation. And looking forward to seeing you all in solidarity in the streets and elsewhere. Take care.
Thank you.